Since I was rather galloping through the final slides of the lecture on Monday, I just wanted to take a more leisurely approach to some of the information that I wanted to communicate to you on Monday morning. I'll pick up the slides in respect to the kind of more general attitudes of the Labour Party. And here I want to point you in the direction of the work of Caroline Knowles, who has suggested that, contrary to our image of the Labour Party as being a party convinced and concerned with social justice, she argues that it has not always applied those values to ethnic minorities. She gives a number of examples in her book. For example, she talks about the unease which the Labour Party had about defending Jews in the East End of London in the interwar period. She says that racism wasn't seen there to be the fundamental problem for the Labour Party. Rather, the concern was the electoral threat and political threat which fascism posed to social democratic parties. She argues that for much of the post-war period, Labour's approach to matters of ethnicity was one which attributed negative and damaging significances to immigrants, to multiracialism and to ethnic minorities, and that in many respects the Labour Party was a party to sustaining anti-immigrant hostility in the UK. For example, she argues that race relations legislation, far from being primarily concerned with tackling racism, was really principally concerned with preserving public order. Nevertheless, a strong black and anti-racist lobby did emerge within the party in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. There were major concerns by the Labour Party National Executive Committee and by the Trade Union Congress from the mid-1970s onwards, given the rise of the National Front and the electoral threat it did seem to pose to the Labour Party. And from the early 1980s there was a determination by the party that the 1971 Immigration Act and the 1981 British Nationality Act would be replaced with more non-discriminatory laws. What preoccupied the party for much of the 1980s was the campaign that ethnic minority activists undertook within the party to organise black sections, which would have a similar constitutional status as the women's sections that the party already had. That was a campaign which was opposed by the party's leadership, but nevertheless a compromise was struck in 1989 with the creation of a black socialist society. As the party moved into the 1990s, the focus shifted very much onto individual selection races, where there were allegations that black or Asian members had deliberately set out to hijack local Labour parties in order to push through favoured ethnic minority nominations. So the accusation here was one of ethnic entryism. There were allegations of corruption, ballot rigging and even intimidation in parties such as Glasgow Govan, Manchester Gorton, Birmingham Sparkbrook and Birmingham Smallheath. The other kind of significant development came in the 1980s, which was the rise of left-wing Labour councils, and a number of these in the 1980s made determined efforts to aid ethnic minority communities in their council areas. Lambeth was in many respects the model. They created a race relations unit which undertook positive action programmes, monitored racial matters and so on. But this, along with the activities of other Labour local councils, was discredited by a political campaign against the loony left, as it was so called. This made a number of allegations. For example, there were stories in newspapers that Haringey had banned black dustbin bags, that it prevented school children from singing Bar Bar Black Sheep. However, the media research group at Goldsmiths College found that all those stories were fabrications or distortions. We need to have some sense of what the Conservatives have done to engage with ethnic minority voters and to encourage them to be involved in the party. In the late 1970s there were some efforts here. A ethnic minority unit was set up in central office. An Anglo-Asian and an Anglo-West Indian Conservative Society were also set up, and there were many efforts in the 1980s and 1990s to connect the party in particular with the Asian community, where it was suggested by many in the party that there was a kind of entrepreneurial bond. Nevertheless, the party's efforts to engage with the ethnic minority vote have had limited success, and likewise its efforts to try and encourage more ethnic minority candidates have also had limited success. A more determined effort certainly has been undertaken since 1997. William Hague's modernisation project had a clear objective of seeking to increase ethnic minority participation in party affairs and to try and select more ethnic minority candidates. So the kind of initiatives that we have seen undertaken recently by David Cameron are ones which have a substantial legacy, are ones which have been attempted over the last decade really. We need to have some sense of the British far right. There are some excellent books by Nigel Copsey and Thurlow, for example, on this, if you want to explore it in more depth. What I want to start off by saying here is that the British far right has always been fragmented and relatively marginal, particularly when you compare it with other European countries, for example, Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National in France. The support for the far right did grow in the 1970s. The National Front saw a significant increase in its support, but that nevertheless faded at the turn of the decade. Some of the literature suggests that this was a consequence of the Conservative Party undercutting its appeal by having a much tougher immigration policy under Margaret Thatcher. Nevertheless, since the early to mid-1990s, the BNP has been growing in its support. It currently has 56 councillors, which out of a total of 22,000 doesn't sound a lot, but is nevertheless quite significant in terms of electoral success for a far-right party. It also now has a member of the London Assembly. In the 2005 election, it stood 119 candidates, again a relatively significant number for a far-right party, and although it only won 0.7% of the vote nationwide, that did increase to 4.2% where a BNP candidate had stood. In terms of ethnic minorities themselves and the political system, obviously one potential source of power for those ethnic minority groups is at the ballot box. As we saw in the map that I showed very early on in the lecture, ethnic minorities tend to be concentrated in particular constituencies, and this is something which has been picked up since the mid-1970s as potentially having an impact on election results. A 1974 Community Relations Commission study was the first to identify this. Operation Black Vote, which is a non-party campaign to increase ethnic minority turnout at elections in the 2005 campaign, identified 71 constituencies where ethnic minorities could be crucial to the outcome. However, one thing which has perhaps limited that is the predominant tendency of ethnic minorities to support the Labour Party. Typically, around about 80% of the ethnic minority vote has gone to the Labour Party in general elections since 1974. And the argument here could be that they are taken for granted in respect of the Labour Party and that other political parties do not see the potential to make significant inroads into that ethnic minority vote. However, there was a significant change, certainly in respect to the 2005 election, with the shift in the vote of Muslim voters. As we see from the table here, where there was a significant proportion of the population identifying themselves as Muslim, there was a significant drop in Labour's vote. Here the Liberal Democrats were the principal beneficiary, obviously in terms of their policies on the Iraq conflict. Conservatives picked up rather fewer of those votes and indeed saw their support fall equally in constituencies where there was a significant Muslim population. Whether this pattern will persist and whether it marks a fundamental change in British electoral politics in respect to ethnic minorities is an interesting question to think about. We need to also say something about ethnic minorities in the British political system. Here, as we can see, there has been a trend towards an increase in ethnic minority representation in Parliament. Again, it's important here to bear in mind that there were 3 ethnic minority MPs who sat in Parliament before World War II, the first of which took their seat in 1892. But in the post-war period, it wasn't until 1987 that the first ethnic minority MP was elected. Currently we have 15 MPs, 2.3% of the House of Commons is regard themselves as ethnic minorities. But were Parliament to reflect the UK's overall ethnic diversity, we would be expecting to see around about 55 to 60 ethnic minority MPs on the green benches of the House of Commons. In respect of those ethnic minority representatives that we do have, there are similar considerations here that apply to women MPs. There are the pressures of party discipline which limit their capacity to act as representatives of their particular ethnic minority community. There is also the fact that those MPs are dependent on white electors very often as much as they are dependent on the votes of their particular ethnic community. And the other issue which emerges certainly from the literature is that most of those ethnic minority MPs want to advance the claims of their party and do not want to be seen to be the exclusive representative of their ethnic